Welcome to this session where we're talking about TeacherLand. TeacherLand's an incredibly exciting development from here at Osiris Educational and in partnership with Routledge or Taylor Francis if you're other parts of the world. So what this is it's an online program to try and develop teachers and develop the expertise, taking that kind of novice teacher through to an expert. It's available for teachers right across the range, no matter what subject you teach, no matter what age group you teach. It's all about your expertise and making that really happen. So I think it's really important just to kind of track, why would we do this? Why is it so important? And I think this is one of the challenges we've had. We've been going for 28 years as a company. We've trained over 500,000 teachers across about 16,000 schools. So it's quite a journey. And during that time, we've developed many programs, and we've seen the whole area of professional learning and school improvement really changing quite dramatically as more research and we become more informed. And what TeacherLand is sits right at the edge of that, right at the forefront of where perhaps teacher training is going to go in the future. So I just kind of take you back in time a little bit to the kind of 1960s. Now, pre-1960s, obviously we were qualifying teachers. Through the training, we did know something about pedagogy and elements of it. Piaget had already been around at that time, Vygotsky and other ideas. And these were shared, obviously, on teacher training courses, but very little was done in schools at that point to really take it forward. And during the 60s and 70s, we started to embrace complexity as we realized the relationship between teachers and students was very different and changed. And it wasn't just the subject causing it to change. It was the constituent parts, the inheritance of the class that you had. But we were realizing then that every teacher was completely different in their form. So that was the way it was developing really right through to the 70s. In the 80s, we then kind of moved to this notion of a scientification of education, and particularly the development of the teachers and just the emerging science of school leader development as well at that point. So what we were trying to do then was move into a much more logical structure, which became quite linear in nature, where there was a notion of we need to have a lesson plan. It needs to go through certain progressions if it's going to be the most effective way. And then the notion of behavior management became much more amplified in this because we needed the learners to operate in a certain way. And take that on through then to the 2000s, and data started to inform that linear progression. So we could start to look at the data, the impact on the students, and then use that to actually focus back and say, okay, so what's happening in the classroom? And then from that, we got the emergence of people like Mazzano, Hattie, and then later comes the EEF, where we started to take all the research, put it into metadata analyses, and really start to dig down to find out what the highest probability options for us were within teaching. And we knew then, so Inside the Black Box had come out, and we'd really started to understand things like formative assessment and how it was working. And there's been a real improvement in terms of teachers' professional knowledge as we've gone through that process. However, and here is the however, we were starting to abandon the complexity. And so there started to become one way to do things. And a lot of the coaching and the mentoring tried to push a one-way vision, and this was the way it was going to happen. And there was this growing realization that actually, and this is what we'd been seeing through our programs, every teacher was different. And it seemed to be that the biggest indication of how the way a teacher was and the way a teacher behaved and the way that they had a view of how things would work was the way they were parented, because it's such a significant imprint on their lives. And then coming on that, second on that, was how they experienced success at school. And so often teachers were trying to replicate that, the combination between what their parents or what their caring situation had done for them and this experience of success. And then that would go into their early teaching. And so they would start then to adapt some of the stuff that was going on. But the default was very much back to that. And this kind of notion of forged in the furnace of experience became really true. In many cases, it became a best endeavors basis. The expertise grew, but it was kind of random. And almost it was so random that when there was a time when there was a directed time for CPD, such as an inset day, there was as much chance of learning something as there was in a non-directed time, which might have been during refreshments after work, where everything was unpacked and the aha moments came, or when the planning came at 8 o'clock on a Sunday or a Friday evening, when you started to think about, well, what am I going to do? What am I going to approach the next day? And this is the complex area that we're looking at. So what we're understanding now is, well, where do we need to move forward to this? And this is what TeacherLand really looks at. What can it actually be going forward, and how do we develop this teacher expertise in the notion of complexity? So what TeacherLand is the first attempt to do is to create a non-linear structure which starts with the individual teacher right at the center of it and then builds around their expertise. So what we're saying is, what does this evolving of expertise look like? So we're saying there's really three areas here, and I'm going to start at the bottom because this is the new approach to professional learning development, which is very much the, can we map what people are already doing? Because if we can't map what people are already doing, we're trying to add, we end up with a linear structure, which they may buy into or they may not do. But we're trying to add to their professional expertise without knowing whether they already know that or they already understand the underlying concepts. And that becomes quite crucial, as you see, as I break this down in terms of how it works and the way that we're evolving this, how important that becomes. So that non-linear element is the first really change in the set piece that we're looking at here. The second element here, looking through the pedagogy, but breaking it down and curating it into its fine-grained form to get absolute clarity in it. And what we've done very differently here is to break down knowledge into learning pivots. And I'm going to give you some examples of this. One is where we look at feedback. Now, we know that every teacher in the world is giving feedback. Yeah, they will all nod their heads and say, yes, I'm doing feedback. Yet when we look at the research, we know that 1/3 of feedback has a negative impact, 1/3 roughly has no impact or zero impact, and 1/3 has a really high impact. And the question comes, well, how come? Why is it if every teacher's giving feedback, it's so different in terms of the moderators on the process? And it's only when you break it down to the learning pivots that underpin feedback that it starts to make sense. So each concept that we're going to be looking at within TeacherLand breaks down into 5, 6, or 7 learning pivots. Now, in the case of feedback, we know 2 important at the end, which are kind of the most ignored by teachers, or should I say the teachers who are having negative impact or no impact, are, number 1, does that student wish to receive feedback at that moment in time from that teacher? Is there a trust relationship there? And do they have that balance in believing that what the teacher is going to say to them is actually going to improve their outcomes? And then secondly, did the teacher bother to follow it up to make sure that the student acted on the feedback? Because we don't have students trained to act on the feedback and trusting in the feedback to do them well, the feedback construct starts to collapse, if that makes sense. So what we're finding is in those nuances of the learning pivot is where the activation of professional knowledge and professional expertise starts to really ramp up. So what we're doing within TeacherLand is really getting right into the depth of the analysis of the research. And then the next element of it is this kind of step-by-step journey. And so a step-by-step journey is going to look different for each teacher. For one teacher, it may be feedback that they need to develop first. Another, it may be scaffolding. Another may be struggling with things. Sorry, Blair, I'm going to have to stop there. I've got a message come up on my screen. I'm just saying, please reboot the system to allow the installation of security patches. I'll just go a no for this. I didn't know whether it would come through, you see, on your presentation. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just checking with my notes. I'll go back to that tick, actually. So thirdly, to become a better version of your professional self by a step-by-step approach. And what this means is really honing into who you are, what it is you need rather than what would we like to experience as a whole school, and then taking that stage by stage. And this online program allows you to do that. So if you want to start with scaffolding, that's fine. If you wanted to start with feedback, that's equally fine. Each one of these different modules will interact with your knowledge and your expertise and uplift the whole of it. It doesn't just discreetly operate in one little block. So what this is allowing you to do is to bring that whole thing together. Now, in order to do this, what we want to be able to do is build from your strengths. Okay, and this is that notion. And so to do this, what we do is we use a testing mechanism at the front end. And we don't just test your concept of yourself or your kind of confidence in what you're doing. We actually test your professional knowledge. And these tests are quite tough. I'll warn you in advance. And all answers are right, correct. You know, there's nothing we do, or very little we do in education, that will have a negative impact on children. But there's always one answer which is more right than the others. And that also enables you to start working in, it causes your brain to start working in the ways that it wants to solve that issue. Why didn't I understand that? Or what could I add to my understanding within that area? So you choose your strength, you choose your area that you go in. It will then let us know and let you know very directly what you need to do next. The next stage we're going to look at is challenging your misconceptions. This is really important because if you've got bits of the learning pivots that you understand, other bits which are kind of a little bit unclear on, it will gradually build together that whole learning pivot so you can really make a great sense of it inside your own brain. And effectively, what we're doing is adding to your schemata of teaching, because that's what you want to build, so you know what to do when you need to know. Now, why is that so important now? It's so important because really we're now in that stage where we're embracing the complexity of what's going on in education, and it means we're having to move to a more adaptive and responsive form of learning. So we can start off with great learning plans, but that isn't necessarily how the lesson will evolve. So this notion of growing your own toolkit becomes fundamental to it. And we actually give you a section in here where you can put all your biggest pieces of learning and your kind of forward nods onto it, into your toolkit, or the practical ideas that you found in the system. So it all becomes part of your toolkit. So when you don't know what to do, you have a whole bank of professional tools that will help you to move forward. Or if you thought you knew what to do, you're able to challenge those and get much more impact with those students when you're adapting and when you're responding to the challenges of the learner as they present themselves back to your learning plan. And another area we're looking at is how you power your practice. We know that professional knowledge has grown, but we also know that the toughest part is embedding that knowledge so it actually becomes activated in your practice. And so what we're doing here is breaking everything down to a series of +1s and encouraging you to develop a +1 in each area. So then from that, you can develop a theory of action in your mind. How's this going to work? And then a deliberate practice routine to make sure that you do it. We have to do this many times over, because when you're focusing, and we know this from the research we've been doing, when you're focusing on doing something new, the focus comes onto you, the teacher. Yeah, what we want you to do eventually is to get that focus past your emotional response to doing something different onto focusing what happens to the learner and what happens to all the learners in your class. And the other bit we're going to say was, how do we then move you on to become a master of pedagogy? Because we know pedagogy sits there as our main tool, as that kind of interdependent element between the content and the subject knowledge that we're trying to get across. But what we're trying to do, no matter what subject you teach or what age, it becomes about the way that you teach it, much more important than the what. And even more important than the way you teach it is the way you think about it. So not what you're doing, the way you're thinking about the response. And this, in many ways, is about having a pick up and play element to it, that we can keep it simple for you, break these down to just little 2-minute chunks or slightly longer chunks, and that you've got it there to use immediately. And once you've done that, you've got that ability to evaluate your impact. And this is the great dynamic in this program. The evaluation of your impact allows you to continue to personalize your teaching process. So you're not on a route to become a one-size-fits-all teacher. You're on to become the best and most professional version of yourself that you possibly can. So what we're saying here then is, yes, we have intent. Yes, we've experienced success. And yes, we've got early teaching moving forward and forging that kind of experience. But what we're now is drip feeding all this professional pedagogical knowledge into practical actions that you can take. So that intent with the high probability and using highest probability strategies, yeah, but then it becomes about us being responsive and adaptable to the outcomes as that progresses. So that is where the learning arises, and that's where this becomes really crucial as a tool. We reckon that in a really great teacher will be managing about 10,000 variables in any one lesson. It's complex, it's highly nuanced, and we've got to be able to manipulate those. When we've studied teachers who are at the early stages of their career, perhaps struggling a little bit, they're only trying to manage about 150 variables. So what's the difference in that? 150 variables, most of them you're focusing on yourself and the content and the delivery. Once you get to the 10,000, you're really looking at the whole impact moving across big groups of students and how they're working, how they're interacting, and how they're making sense, what misconceptions are getting buried in their knowledge, where there's errors, whether they're being pushed to the point where they're making mistakes, which can then be unpicked and evolved, whether challenge is happening at every level. So that's where we're trying to head into. To do that, we picked certain content areas here, and we've got 15 in this module of TeacherLand. And I'll just briefly mention each of these so you've got a sense of what you're getting into. Prior knowledge, we know that 50% of what happens is prior knowledge within the classroom. So we need to really nail what prior knowledge is, how we draw it out of students, how we understand what misconceptions they've got, and how we sequence and build from the prior knowledge, because progressions from prior knowledge is the learning. It's not just what we've got written in the curriculum. Memory, we know how important this is, the schemata that students bring, but it's how we can manipulate that memory in order to make it more memorable and more sticky. The modelling area then looks at what we do as teachers. It's number one in terms of the most common teaching methodology, and yet we don't study it perhaps as much as we should do. So this brings a real nuanced understanding to the modelling. Metacognition, that ability for learners to unpick their own thinking about learning, but also for us to be able to facilitate that, becomes really crucial. Then we move on to probing. This starts with questioning, but moves much more beyond questioning. It's about checking the secureness of the understanding and moving into that kind of construct of overlearning, so it becomes owned by the learner. We looked at spacing then. The whole notion right the way from interleaving through the testing interleaving to really securing knowledge at a much faster and accelerated pace. We then look at differentiation. Differentiation, one of the most misunderstood areas probably in the teacher's toolkit. And we look at the difficulties of why differentiations become so difficult to understand, but really what you can do practically given a mixed ability grouping and how you should work within those. Instructional scaffolding, then obviously one of the techniques within differentiation and massive support to modelling. But how do you do this best? How does it work for learners? And how do you get rid of the scaffold so you don't create a lot of transitional moments in teaching, which obviously then put the effort back into the learner to do the linking up. We then move on to learner resilience, and we're looking very much and accepting that there is a twin track here, that we're developing a learner at the same time as we're developing their progressions in learning. And that learner resilience is all about academic buoyancy, making sure they can pick themselves up if they come across those difficult stuck moments. And then we get to the whole area around effort. I remember when we were growing up at school, I mean, it was always must work harder. I think we need to apply an awful lot more nuanced understanding to that effort and what that effort produces in terms of expectations and the effect size that it's capable of creating. Teacher self-efficacy looks at your own beliefs and your own professionalism and what you bring to the equation. And this obviously applies to you getting promotions and moving, but how you model your behaviours around the school. In automaticity, we unlock the kind of areas of independent learning and interdependent learning. How does a student secure that overlearned understanding so they've got absolute clarity on it, so it takes the pressure off their executive function and their working memory, so therefore then they can move forward at a faster pace? feedback-driven teaching we mentioned already in this element about the feedback and what we need to do. And then we move on to sequencing. And here we're looking at internal sequencing and external sequencing. Obviously, how we put a curriculum together, how we start, and a kind of notion of understanding by design, or some people call it teaching backwards, but that notion of having an endpoint in mind and coming backwards and planning forward. But we also look at the sequencing coming from prior knowledge, and how do we build progressions based on where the learner is in terms of their understanding of the subject, but also their understanding of themselves as learners. And lastly, and by no means least, we look at teacher collective efficacy. We know this has the highest effect size, and yet we know it's kind of quite often misunderstood and put under teacher collaboration. There's nothing wrong with teacher collaboration. However, the effect size is not very high. Teacher collective efficacy has the highest effect size of anything that we can do. So it becomes really, really important. So those are the 15 modules and areas that we'll study. So how does it work? So you start with a perception and reality analysis. What we mean by this is you're going to be tested on your professional knowledge within those learning pivots, and you're going to be tested on your concept, your self-concept in terms of your confidence. And the scaling between those two will give you an indication. It goes into what we call the mobilizer, and the knowledge mobilizer will then allow you to enter in. As I said, that every module is broken down to constituent learning pivots. These are unique to TeacherLand, and they've been developed by the professionals who wrote this based on all the latest research that we've got available to us out there. So with each pivot comes a bibliography. In the bibliography are links to things from all over, the curated links to things from all over the internet, which look at either the background research. So if you weren't sure about the concept or disagreed with the research, have a look at the research papers. They also include overviews of the concept within that pivot, so you can understand in detail what it's trying to do and where it's trying to get you at. And then thirdly, it's got some very practical resources, ideas for you to use in your classroom immediately from all different subject areas from all over the world and for all different age groups. So you've got a lot of practice there as well. And the idea is that you formulate those into a theory of action, which you can then put into practice within your classroom. So that's where you're heading. Now, we know from the research that 20% you can see in the classroom quite easily, but our challenge here is to make the other 80% really accessibly visible. So that's what we're trying to do, is to work around this. Okay. You can track your personal journey there, and you'll have a mobilizer like this, which will light up as you go along, and you've secured each of those modules. Each of the learning pivots, and then they form together. So when that chart's all glowing, you've completed TeacherLand. You should have a fantastic toolkit. As I say, it's non-linear. You can dip in and out of which modules as you need. If you've got an emphasis within the school in one area, dive into that area. If you're looking at your own practice or problems within it, you might want to dive into another area. You don't need to complete one module before you move on to another. It will just keep going and reminding you of where you've got to and which bits you can focus on next time. And you can choose whether you identify your strengths and work on those, or choose your weaker areas, and you can do that based off your own concept, working with other people within your group, maybe your line manager or anything, with feedback you've been given. And it will give you an objective way of looking at it. But this is really, really comfortable because it's only you who can see this. So you'll know where you're at and where you're moving to. So you can dip in for 2 minutes, or you can take a longer session and maybe do it over a whole day if you want, or do an accelerated improvement in teaching if that's where you wanted to get to. You can take control of your own professional development, upgrade your professionalism, and elevate your own career to the level you want it to be, so you can become the best version of yourself. And we have said everyone's different. This is a powerful partnership between Osiris Educational and Routledge, so we're very excited to be able to share it with you. Now, at this stage, it's only available as a beta test model, but the good news is it's free. So what we're looking to do is to recruit a group of beta testers. You can sign up for it. It's yours. You can't share it with anyone else. It's just for you to have a go at it, have a play with it, and give us some feedback on it. So we look very much forward to you visiting, first of all, teacherland.world, and then just register and say, yeah, I'm interested in joining the beta testing team. And you'll be at the forefront of where education is developing to and what's possible. AI is not in teacher education just yet. It's coming, and we hope this is one of the forerunners for it. Thank you for watching.